philosophy has become, I think, too much of an academic discipline.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk, the state of public philosophy.
Less people, dramatically less people than, let's say, in the 19th century among the philosophers, are aware, I would say, that the ultimate thing would be to get in touch with an audience that is not just academic, that's not just your students.
What is the role of the public intellectual in the 21st century?
Has philosophy become elite and irrelevant?
What I think is important is to not only be rational, but sometimes come up with weird proposals that get discussions going.
Out of the ivory tower and onto the streets.
Basically, yes, I want to reach a larger audience with what I'm writing and less footnotes.
Our guest is Hans Gumbrecht, author of Reading Moods, The Different Ontology of Literature.
I also try to make some money with it, which is always a good criterion whether you reach somebody or not.
The state of public philosophy. Coming up on Philosophy Talk. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the Marsh Theater, San Francisco's breeding ground for new performance.
Our thinking originates at Stanford University's Philosophers' Corner.
Welcome, everyone, to Philosophy Talk. Our topic today is the state of public philosophy.
Well, Philosophy Talk is a public philosophy radio program. We're a philosophy program on public radio. We're devoted to public philosophy. We're devoted to making public philosophy better. But I suppose at some point we ought to ask, within all that, what is it we're trying to do?
Well, our first aim, John, is to encourage the public, our listeners and our participants in our blog, our Facebook friends, to actually get off their duffs and do some philosophy themselves, to engage in this ongoing activity of philosophy. I mean, we think that because we think philosophy's fun, but also because if more people do philosophy, I think the world will be a better place. Our public discussion and debates and decisions will be better for everybody doing philosophy.
So we'll have happier people living in a better world if they just will listen to Philosophy Talk. Now, a second thing we try to do is to acquaint people with what influential philosophers of the past and the present have been worried and thought about.
That's true, but that's a secondary aim. Well, why are we interested in getting people to think about what the great philosophers have talked about and what the great philosophers are thinking about? Because we think our audience should and may want to think about the same things in the same kind of deep philosophical way.
Okay, now we've cleared up what it is we're all about. Now, what is it that people are worried about? What is it that we're worried about when they worry about the state of public philosophy?
Well, some people worry, and I worry about this myself, that modern-day philosophers, especially in America, don't have the same impact on public life that philosophers once had, and that philosophers still do have, at least in some countries, especially in places like Europe.
Well, our experience certainly suggests that, some of our experience. Lots of public radio stations and their program directors are quite amazed, startled, blown over, can't believe it when we say, oh, we've got a philosophy program that we think deserves a spot on your public radio station. They're very skeptical that their listening public would be interested. It just, philosophy doesn't seem like the sort of thing that the public really wants to hear about to these people.
Right, there is this skepticism. You want to do what on the radio? You want to do philosophy on the radio? But, we've done this for a while now, and part of our experience points in a completely opposite direction from that skepticism. I mean, many people are very interested in the topics we talk about, the issue, the ideas, the great dead philosophers. Just in my own lifetime, I think I've seen an increase, actually, in the impact of people in our profession and public life. I think of some of our past guests, Daniel Dennett, Martha Nussbaum, Anthony Appia. I mean, they're all excellent philosophers. I have great admiration for them all. They write widely read books. They appear frequently, not just on this program, but they're all over the radio dial and even sometimes on TV and op-ed pages. So there is an increase in some circles.
Well, I think you're right about that, and I think in my somewhat longer lifetime, I've seen a similar trend. But it's not just that philosophy, over the period I've been observing it, has more impact in the wider public, I think it also has more impact in what you might call a narrower philosophy public. That is, our colleagues in other disciplines and related disciplines, I think, take philosophers more seriously than they did when I got started in the 60s. The ideas of thinkers like John Rawls and Michael Bratman, for example, are very influential, taught in courses in law schools.
Well, that's true. And if you think of areas that you and I both overlap with, AI, cognitive science, computer science, philosophy has had a not inconsiderable influence in the development of those disciplines.
But the one place that we, in the sense of American analytical philosophers like you and I, don't seem to have had much of an impact, not as much as one would expect, is in the humanities.
Oh, that's true. I think you're understating it. I think there's been this great divide between philosophy and the other humanities, especially if you think of we haven't proven to be very inspiring at all to our comrades in literature, especially comparative literature and cultural anthropology and places like that. We're kind of at odds with those folks.
European thinkers like Derrida seem to have been of more interest to people in literature and even in history. In a wider sense, all humanists are really involved in the philosophical enterprise. So this seems surprising and rather sad.
I agree with you. It is rather sad. Our guest today is someone who feels this lack of impact intensely. That would be Hans Gumbrecht from the Comparative Literature Department at Stanford, which, by the way, was also home of our dear and late colleague Richard Rorty in the last part of his life.
Gumbrecht is a philosopher, and he's also a public intellectual. Like Rorty, he's both been influenced by, and at the same time, I think, deeply skeptical about certain aspects of the prevailing approach to philosophy in America, that is, analytical philosophy, as we call it. So I'm very much looking forward to thinking through these issues with Sepp, as everyone calls him.
And we'll want our live audience here, our deeply philosophical, public-minded audience here at the Marsh to join in the conversation, too.
But first, we're going to hear from our roving philosophical reporter, Caitlin Esch. She's gone off and talked to someone who's trying to make philosophy more a part of public life from a much different angle. She files this report.
Mike Lee isn't a teacher, and he doesn't really consider himself a philosopher. But that hasn't stopped him from volunteering to teach philosophy in Los Angeles public schools.
I sometimes start talking about just the word philosophy. I would tell them, if you look at the word philosophy, it means, from Greek, the love of wisdom.
And then he might say, what is love? Or what makes a good student? Or are video games real? Lee studies Japanese and music. He started LA's branch of the Socrates Cafe, an informal national network of adults who meet to discuss big life questions. Then he decided to bring these questions to 9 and 10-year-olds.
One thing that's shocking is that even adults that I facilitate dialogues with, they can't really form a very good or coherent or articulate moral position.
Lee hopes that by starting philosophical debates early, kids might learn to think critically and form moral opinions.
If it becomes a habit of theirs, then it would probably change how they think about everything.
For example, here's a clip of Mount Holyoke professor Tom Wartenberg explaining how philosophy can work in an elementary school classroom.
You really see kids talking and thinking.
When my baby cousin, he always cries. He'd be talking baby language, I know what he says, and he'd be hungry, and I had to feed him.
We don't teach them what philosophers have said about anything. We want the children themselves to be philosophizing.
So without ever mentioning Plato or Socrates, instructors get kids to consider questions like, what is it to be brave? Can I be brave and scared at the same time? Again, Mike Lee.
When they talk about celebrities, I would pose the question as, what is fame? When they talk about video games, I would ask them about the real world versus the virtual world. Which one is better?
Most of the kids say they'd rather live in the video game world where they can control their fate and never die.
And one girl raised her hand and said, well, but if you think about it, if you live in a video game world, you wouldn't learn real things.
Ultimately, Lee believes if we all spent a little more time engaging in philosophical discussions, we might take our civic duties more seriously, and we might really consider the consequences of our actions. In short, we might build a better democracy. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Caitlin Esch.
I'm John Perry, along with Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the Marsh Theater in San Francisco.
And we're joined now by Hans Gumbrecht. He's a professor of comparative literature at Stanford University. He's author of Reading Moods, the different ontology of literature. Zep, welcome back to Philosophy Talk.
Thank you, thank you.
So, Sepp, you're a person that has roots in many disciplines, including philosophy. How did a nice philosopher like you end up in Stanford's Comp Lit department?
You know, I mean, I can ask myself, how did I end up in the literature department? That's just because they offered me tenure first in literature and not in the philosophy department. It's not what I wanted to be. And when somebody in an airplane asks me, sees that there's some Stanford words on my stationery or so, and they ask me, what are you doing? I will admit, I kind of lie, and I say I do philosophy normally.
Well,
So
you do philosophy normally, and of course, in a while back, you could say, "Oh, I'm in Richard Rorty's department," and everybody would just assume it was philosophy. But I want to set the stage for some uninhibited discussion
Right.
amongst the three of us. We're old friends; we've known each other for a long time. How do you see the state of philosophy and public philosophy, especially in America?
Well, philosophy, I mean, if you do the history of the word, around 1800, philosophy was the predecessor of the present day word intellectual. When you said a philosopher in the when you say philosopher today, I'm a philosopher, like I said yesterday in the airplane, people know that I'm in a philosophy department at a university, and that is normally disconnected with philosophy. Now, if you ask me why this is so, I actually think this is not so different between America and Europe. It may be slightly better in Europe. We can discuss about that later. But it is because philosophy professors in Europe are mainly historians of philosophy. They don't, I mean, to say it drastically, they hardly ever think themselves. They're historians, right? And, I mean, randomly some of them become public intellectuals, but that's not typical. Whereas I think in analytic philosophy, I would even concede you guys do think more than European colleagues, but it is on very specific, as you like to call them, technical problems. Technical problems that are very difficult for somebody to understand who doesn't have any previous knowledge. And in both cases, I think, this natural kind of development into public intellectual has been cut off and interrupted.
Well, I mean, I agree that analytic philosophy, as the kind that John and I do, has some very technical aspects. You know, it's connected to logic and mathematics and science and all that, but that's really just a part of philosophy. I mean, there's still deep thinking as there ever was about the nature of human society, human morality, all. I mean, philosophy still thinks about the problems that it's always thought about, sometimes with more technical apparatus. So I don't think it's just the technical nature of philosophy, because not all philosophy is technical, and the age-old problems are still there, even if they're in a new dress.
Well, I mean, there are two things I want to say. One thing is that I do think that less people, dramatically less people than, let's say, in the 19th century among the philosophers, both in Europe and in America for different reasons, are aware, I would say, that the ultimate thing would be to get in touch with an audience that is not just academic, that's not just your students, and also, and we can talk about that later, I think it is sometimes just too rational. I mean, I think if what philosophers thinking would be somehow weirder, to say it this way, it would be more provocative.
Spoken like a true humanist. We'll have to pick out. This is Philosophy Talk, coming to you from the Marsh Theater in San Francisco. We're discussing the state of public philosophy with Hans Gumbrecht from Stanford University.
Philosophy, is it the province of nitpickers and those consumed by irrelevant paradoxes? Well, yeah. Or is it the great theater of the mind, the structure of public discussion of scientific, social, and political issues?
The state of philosophy in public life, along with questions from our live audience, when Philosophy Talk continues.
Auto came directly from Pong. The smart man made everything wrong. Now in the future, as if it was all along, the smart man made everything wrong.
Welcome back to Philosophy Talk. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're discussing the state of public philosophy with Hans Gumbrecht from Stanford University.
Are philosophers important in the public life of the mind? Should they be more or less important? Join the discussion by stepping up to one of the microphones at either side of the stage.
Okay, so Sap, I'm going to concede you something. I'm going to say out a bunch of names. And I bet you if I ask the audience, or you even, to free associate on these names, they might not mean that much to you. Hartree Field, Huh? Draw a blank. Stephen Schiffer. Willard Van Orman Quine.
Well, Quine, yeah.
Wilfred Sellers.
Yeah.
John Rawls.
Rawls, of course.
Jason Stanley.
Yeah.
Timothy Williamson. Okay, those are some young, old, dead, great American analytic philosophers. All of them is a great, but not many of them are public figures of renown. Okay, suppose we took the APA, the Eastern APA, which is the most powerful philosophical organization in America, and we put a stink bomb in it, and it drove all the philosophers underground to air out for, 20 years. What would public life be missing if all those people went away?
Public life wouldn't be missing as much as it could be missing, because I think it has not managed, and that's not so different in Europe, to reach the public sphere. I mean, the question is, why should the public sphere care about philosophy?
Right. That's one question. Yeah.
I mean, philosophy has become, I think, both in Europe and here, too much of an academic discipline. I think it should be an academic discipline, but my ideal would be that an academic discipline, it would have this projection to produce ideas, to produce impulses that could be interesting for society.
If the scientific establishment went away tomorrow, if all the physicists and chemists and biologists went away tomorrow, I don't think anybody would think, oh my God, that doesn't make any difference. They would think, oh, American life, intellectual life, the society would be much worse off.
Well, I don't know. If you listen to Merle's song, you might say we'd be better off.
But science is mostly done in the academy. Pure science, especially, is mostly done in the academy. Industry does some science, but only that which has a great payoff. What's the difference? I mean, science is an academic discipline, but people think if it went away, we'd be worse off.
Well, look, I mean, there's a lot of talking, at least in Europe, but also in America, about this country, this society, the US society, having to invent itself in a different way. If you look at the Obama government, for example, I mean, there are lots of university people being appointed, but they're all specialists. I mean, like our own Steve Chu, for example. I mean, Nobel in physics, very, very competent as an energy minister, no doubt.
Steve Chu is the Secretary of Energy.
Secretary of Energy, who
used to be a professor at Stanford, a Nobel laureate in physics.
Very, very admirable.
Used to be a resident fellow in my dormitory.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, he has been criticized, the president, for having too many university people in the government, but they are specialists for something. Whereas I think where philosophers, humanists, if they could jump that gap, could be more productive, would be precisely where I think the government has been stuck in this promise of reinventing the country, of reinventing the society. And what I think is important there is to not only be rational, but sometimes come up, I will give you one example, with weird proposals that get discussions going. Yeah? I tell you a weird proposal that somebody who is a philosopher in Germany, you have heard the name, or maybe we can do the same test, Sloterdijk, Peter Sloterdijk. He wrote an article, published an article in Die Zeit, I mean, German weekly newspaper, prints about 500,000, saying how strange it is that nobody complains ever about taxes. I mean, people complain about paying too much, but basically everybody pays taxes, and nobody in Europe actually ever thinks that sponsorship could be much more beautiful. You give the same, but you feel good about yourself. But nobody ever in Europe would do that. Universities cannot get any donations going. Now that provocation, I don't think that Sloterdijk ever think people shouldn't pay taxes, but that got a huge public debate going, and clearly people at the universities say it is now, they have an easier time now after this debate, and so forth.
I take your point. I mean, I think there's a point there, and I think it's important about not just philosophy, but the humanities at large. There's a couple different points that I think are really important. Mm-hmm. And I do think our public discourse and our public life is lesser for it. Because one of the things philosophy is for is not just telling us about how things actually work, but for firing the imagination about ways things could be, right? So how could it be that we had a society in which men and women were equal? I mean, before men and women are equal, you ask somebody to imagine the possibility of equality between men and women, and you get the imagination going, and then you reorient reality to fit your imagination rather than constraining. And science mostly tells us how things are, how things actually are, how things that actually are work. But there's this role that has, I don't think we do it enough in our shared life, to fire the imagination about things that are not yet so, but might be. I think that's definitely true, and philosophers could step up to the plate and help us do that.
Well, but let me ask both of you a question. If you picked one philosopher of the 20th century who really has had an impact on American politics, I think it would have to be Ayn Rand. I mean, just within the year, we've had Alan Greenspan, one of the most important and powerful people in America for the past 15 years say that the 2008 economic debacle was in partly based on, his decisions, the reason he didn't see it, was because he had this idea that American CEOs would behave in their own rational self-interest, and he was and is an Ayn Rand disciple. That's where he got that idea. You can see her influence in Congressman Ryan, another Ayn Rand disciple. Alan Greenspan is now going to write a book in which he tells us, miracle of miracles, that she wasn't right about everything, and his book will sell far more copies than my collected works, believe it or not.
Which
now,
is sad.
Yes. Now, there's some thirst for these basic philosophical ideas, for some vision that's a philosophical vision, but why is it left to the Ayn Rands to supply it, and why all the brilliant people like Ken and I and you aren't listened to?
Well, because we haven't managed to make it clear that it is not that we give the ultimate orientation. For example, to be provocative, I think your department, for example, there's too much concentration on ethics. As if you figured out how people should behave and you told them.
Yeah, thank you, I agree with that.
Well, then, our dean, yeah. So, another example. In Europe more than here, there's now a lot of discussion, will medicine be able to make human life, individual life, infinite? That you're not necessarily dying at age 100 or whatever. My grandchildren, 2.5 years, they have officially in Germany a life expectancy of 110 years.
Jeez.
So in 50 years it will be infinite, perhaps. And now there's a discussion going on, an interesting discussion. Is that desirable?
Oh, right.
Now, I don't think our task is to say whether it is desirable or not, but we should get this discussion going.
Well, I think
very much what you are doing here.
I think our task is to explore the possible answers to that questions in a no-hold-barred way. And back to Alan Greenspan and these ideas that get hold and function as ideology. Ideology is not philosophy.
No.
Fixed ideas are not philosophy. Philosophy is subjecting ideas to intense critical scrutiny, trying them on to see if they fit, but also taking them off and saying, wait a minute, where does that idea come from? So you look at it from all angles, and that's what we try to model on this program, and that's what we try to model with our audience. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about the state of public philosophy in front of an audience at the Marsh Theater, and we have questions from that live audience. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, sir. Tell us your name and what your question is.
Hi, my name is Jesse, and I'm wondering, when you said if all the scientists or physicists disappeared, people would notice. They're not the ones actually writing about that topic, though. It's journalists writing about the developments in those fields. So on one hand, what are the developments in philosophy that we should be notified with a news headline? And on the other hand, when you do have a scientist, for example, who reaches out to the public, someone like what Carl Sagan did for physics, where is someone like that from philosophy stepping out? And if they are they telling people that they're a philosopher?
That's a good question. You want to address that
Well,
question?
there is one who has a very successful blog in the New York Times, and that's Stanley Fish. Now, he's a literary critic with a background in law. He's a professor, actually, of law. And he manages to do that, and I know that blog is quite widely read, but I completely agree with you, and there may be a problem. It may not only be the problem of the philosophers. Let's say the equivalent of the New York Times in Germany has a weekly 2-page supplement on the humanities that does exactly what you are doing. And it is very successful, and it's a conservative newspaper. They sell about 50,000 more on Wednesdays when that supplement comes because all the intellectuals want to read that. So
let's this is a complicated, really complicated question. Because we're talking about philosophy, we're using that kind of as a synonym right now for sort of public intellectual of a humanistic bent. But actually there's such a complicated terrain among the humanities, right? Because Stanley Fish, he drives most philosophers crazy. Derrida, he's a philosopher, but he drove most analytic philosophers just completely crazy. So, but he had a public profile, a wide-ranging public profile. So this is a really complicated thing. And in your field, I have this feeling, tell me if I'm wrong or not, that you guys don't really know what you're for anymore. You guys got to have a crisis of confidence, a crisis of narrative of what we're up to. Philosophy, I don't think, has that. It has certain problems and crises, but it does not have a self-conception crisis. So partly the humanities have a problem because they don't know what they're about. They don't know they don't have a story that they can tell to the rest of society about, hey, why should we be important? Do you agree about that or not?
I think the comparative literature departments are the assembly of people who don't believe strongly in the humanities today being compartmentalized into departments where you have specialists. That is true. And in that sense, I mean, using Chomskyan language, you can say we are the dummy symbol, so to speak, right? I mean, yes, I can do, if needed, literary analysis, but basically, yes, I want to reach a larger audience with what I'm writing. I do less footnotes, and I also try to make some money with it, which is always a good criterion whether you reach somebody or not. I mean, yesterday I had to declare the money I brought back from Europe, and it was very interesting. The customs officer was asking me, so what are you giving lectures about? And I was lying once again and said, philosophy. He said, you can make that much money with philosophy.
Oh, I want to know how much money they pay you. Well, we've got another question from our live audience. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, man.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm wondering if your question for the show today isn't actually what is the relationship between philosophy and politics? And my other question would be, isn't the lack of public intellectualism in America deeply related to something like the decline of the public sphere and an increasing privatization of the self, and the sense that our lives and ourselves are not invested in what we would call the public? If you think of something like Facebook, where you just dialogue with people you already know, your peers, there aren't questions coming at you from those you don't know. I think the public sphere is increasingly shrunken.
Julie, I think that's excellent observations, excellent question. About the politics, connection between philosophy and politics. If you mean politics writ large, I agree with you. If you mean it sort of small bore in terms of parties and all that, right, and who's up and who's down and who gets power and who doesn't, I don't agree. But I do think it means something deep about philosophy and the polis, the community, our shared life. And this thing about the decline of the public, I think one of the things that philosophy is for, I said it's for firing up the imagination, but not just firing up the individual imagination. That question I said about, how can men and women be equal? That's a project in shared imagining. What could our lives be like together such that everybody felt inclusive? And philosophy is a thing that invites us to imagine together what the world could be like. And I do think the cocooning of people into little sort of information cocoon has a big role to play in the shape of our...
I think this is precisely the space where we should play a larger role. I'm not saying that they're not structural problems, but I also say, I'm not blaming you, both of you. You have the show, but most of your colleagues don't have the show, and you should ask yourself whether you have gained or lost prestige in your department by doing that show. I'm not so sure, you have certainly gained prestige with me, especially because you invite me, but let me give you one example just very briefly. One answer. I'm not so sure about the public sphere being worse or the decline of the public sphere. That's always being said. But actually, if you look, for example, if you ask good newspapers, what carries the newspaper today, the printed newspapers, they will tell you it is more and more the cultural section, because nobody who needs the economic information can rely on a newspaper today. Nobody does politics can rely on that. So it is not that it's completely lost. I think we don't serve it and we don't deserve it.
I agree with that. But let me go back to this complete philosophy thing. And this may really annoy Ken, what I'm going to say. But, that's life. And lots of times in philosophy, you have some big issue that everybody's kind of had one view on, and then it becomes clear that view is not tenable, or that it's not easily tenable. So you believe in God, and then along comes the Enlightenment, and it's not so obvious. And then things go in two ways. What do bright people do about that? Some very bright people try to work out the implications that there isn't a God, say David Hume. Other bright people try to invent really clever arguments to get around the obvious problems with it. Same with numbers. Numbers aren't things in Platonic heaven. Oh, well, then they must be numerals. They must be marks. A lot of bright people try to figure that out, make it tenable. It ain't easy. Other people say, oh, you haven't shown that they're not numbers in Platonic heaven. You've just shown blah, blah, blah. Well, I think right now, I hate to say this, setting ethics aside, we're dealing with the fact that there's not much to the world except physical reality that anybody's been able to discover. And that's been known since, for quite a while, or it's been apparent to people. And I see the comp-lit people in their not always extremely happy-making way, trying to come to grips with that. I think that's what Derrida was doing. I think that's what Rorty was doing. How can we continue to have how can we continue eating our cake when we clearly don't have it anymore? How do we continue this conversation and this culture in the absence of any objective meaning and stuff? Whereas I tend to think on the philosophy side of things, and I've been a part of this, we try to develop more elaborate schemes to kind of provide some basis of objective meaning, at the extreme of which, and I think philosophy right now is at the extreme of it with all possible worlds and so forth and so on. So I think that part of the divide is just two different reactions to that, and it's time for me to shut up.
No, I think you're onto something, and I think we need to take it up in our next segment. I think you're onto something deep. There's a lot there, John. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're discussing the state of public philosophy with Hans Gumbrecht from Stanford University.
We've been talking about the influence, or lack thereof, of philosophy on American intellectual and public life. Next, we'll look at what role philosophy should play.
We're coming to you from the Marsh Theater, San Francisco's breeding ground for new performance. We'll take more questions from our live audience when Philosophy Talk continues.
Noam Chomsky, a very intelligent, never irrelevant, bold and pedantical man.
Welcome back to the program. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. We're discussing the state of public philosophy with Hans Gumbrecht from Stanford University. So, Zep, I want to go back to what John was saying. He said a lot. There was a lot in there. I think it's true. I think we're kind of in a crisis in our shared life as human beings. And I don't think we've kind of fully owned up to that. I call this philosophy as delivering the news. Like all those old things you used to believe in, religion, you can't believe in them anymore. They don't have any rational foundation. Okay, what's next? Well, what's next? And here's a role for philosophy, and here's a way I think literature and analytic philosophy are going in different directions. Here's a role. Let's reimagine the basis of our lives. Let's start from scratch and reimagine what the basis of our real lived lives could be. And literature departments have gone one way, and philosophy.
I agree with you. I mean, one thing is that comp-lit departments have kind of caught more of the public view with people like Derrida and so forth. But Derrida, for example, while I was the one who invited him to Stanford twice, there was a taboo. And while it drew 2,000 people or something like that, and while nobody knew what he was really talking about, but anyway, I mean, at least, we never had more people in a humanities lecture. But I agree with you that literature and partly philosophy and the humanities have been insisting so much in that no longer discovery that there's nothing but physical reality, that we have a crisis. And I think literature departments or humanities at large and philosophy converge there about reimagining life. That would be a good thing. And maybe sometimes, that's what I'm trying at this point, insisting on certain things that are already there, that they're good, that there are certain things that we do not only have to criticize and question, reinvent.
That's true.
That's my sports book, for example.
But see, here's something that I think the humanities have not done enough of, is insisting that, okay, we have to reimagine our lives together. I mean, I think the general public thinks, well, science tells us how things should be. Well, yeah, science tells you how things are, but it doesn't really tell you how things should be. It doesn't tell you how you should live. I mean, you want to say, what should I value? What are the most important things? Okay, go to a physicist in his lab coat and say, okay, what are the most important things? What should I value? I can't tell you that.
No, but he can ask us, for example. I mean, coming back to that discussion that's big now in Germany and in France about, is this desirable that medicine pushes the possibility of individual life becoming infinite? I mean, this is an interesting discussion, and this is something where we have something to say. My answer would be no. The point is precisely if your entire life is dietetic because you want to reach age 2000, that's not a life.
Well, right, but see, so there's a scientific question of can we extend life? But then there's a philosophical, normative question, what would be the point of extending life? I'm agreeing with you. So what should the state of philosophy be and intellectual thinking about possibilities in human life. It should be like central to everything we do. And the fact that it isn't central, I don't know if to blame that on the philosophers or on the public or on the structure of our society or what.
Well, on this particular issue, there is a literature that began about 30 years ago with Bernard Williams, a paper called the Macropolis Case, where he talks about living forever, and he decides it wouldn't be a good thing. And that illustrates two things. First, philosophers have thought about this, analytical philosophers. Second, they did it in such a boring way that it really had the impact of a fart in the middle of a windstorm, as Ben wished I wouldn't put it.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about the state of public philosophy with Hans Gumbrecht from Stanford University, and we have a question from our live audience.
Hi, I'm Devin from San Francisco, and I wonder what you think about this thought. If things aren't as bad as they seem for philosophy, if you consider all the disciplines that have peeled off philosophy and become pretty productive in their own right, linguistics, geography, physics, economics, all these other people who maybe were not happy calling themselves philosophers and needed to branch out, but in fact have contributed in different domains.
At Cornell, you don't have a department of philosophy. You have the Sage School of Philosophy, as you probably remember from your Cornell days. And Mr. Sage, who gave the money for the Sage School of Philosophy, wanted to call it the Sage School of Phrenology and Philosophy. Phrenology, psychology, and philosophy. But philosophers convinced him that phrenology was just another name for psychology. So I don't, I don't know what my point is, but it seemed relevant.
The question is excellent. The point is excellent, and I think there's something about philosophy. Look, the things we now call science grew out of philosophical thinking about the nature of matter, the nature of the universe. Economics grows out of philosophical thinking about the nature of human rationality and collective rationality and agency and all this stuff. But here's the difference, I think, between philosophy and those other things. Philosophy is mostly concerned with, characteristically concerned with, how possibly could it be that human rational actors working together could have some mechanism of exchange? Economics is wondering, how does it actually work? What are the laws actually governing that? Well, you ask the how possibly question when you're kind of deeply confused. You ask the conceptually, you ask the how actually question. Once you clear up a lot of that conceptual confusion, you can make progress. So when philosophy is successful in clearing up the thing, it's no longer called philosophy. That's part of our birthright.
Exactly,
we're the mother who gives birth to new ways of thinking.
That is very, very beautiful.
And it's also true.
Well, you get very sore after a while with giving a birth.
I hope that our parts function well to do that. But look, for example, I feel it is also partly of how philosophy is being taught, or humanities are being taught. I think it would be important in the present situation to not only teach technical problems in analytic philosophy or history of philosophy in what you call continental philosophy, but to show the students that there's an opening for problems, in a very Socratic mood, so to speak. For example, I've been trying to launch that and then get some resonance for that in Europe, the concept of contemplation. What we're doing in the humanities and philosophy is not research, but contemplation. And to do that also in teaching, to tell somebody, to spend maybe a week with one text and to read it slowly and to think about it. That is not something you can teach by instruction, but by doing with somebody. And I think that is something that has failed. We have taught too much technical problems, history of philosophy, and I think that's equivalent.
Okay, now here's part of the problem in America. I don't know about the rest of the world. Here's part of the problem in America. I agree with the sentiment deeply, but I'm going to try and look at it from the other side. Okay. I give somebody science or math teaching. I can give them tests. I can measure their progress. They can be standardized tests. I can know that I've done something. Right? Well, how do I test whether they're good at contemplating? Right? They come up with all kinds of crazy ideas. How do you measure that? Americans want measurable things.
Well, what I'm doing, I'm giving them all an A because I know.
See? See?
Yes.
That's the problem. You got to flunk some of them.
No, I don't. I actually don't because I do know if I do that right. Like Philosophical Reading Group, they know how good or bad they are. They don't need this long commentary from me. I talk to them a lot. I do a lot of office hours. I precisely think that we have to de-scientificize, so to speak, or de-academicize a little bit of our teaching. I mean, it should be more. It should be more what we are doing here, what we are doing when we're teaching philosophy.
I agree with you, but I'm saying there's a huge barrier. The culture of our collectivity is very much into measuring things that can be measured and replicated, and things that have a concrete, traceable payoff.
Yeah. I mean, the worst part of the evaluations I get quarter after quarter at Stanford is the question: did the professor state clearly enough the criteria for grading?
Yeah.
And they always get very, very bad. I mean, horrible grades there, and I'm proud of it.
Let's take another question from our live audience. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, man.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. You were speaking about the idea of measurable phenomena or measurable information. I feel like our culture is moving more towards that of being one of finite chunks of information in many ways with the internet and sort of the death of books and the rise of digital formats of information. And philosophy seems like something that just takes time and takes space.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
That's exactly what I meant by contemplation. It is about a certain resistance today that everything has to go fast. You have to constantly check your email, Facebook, etc., to not do that for a day perhaps, and just concentrate on a certain problem, even without asking what comes out of it. That's different from the first part of the just this slowing down, entschleunigen, you can say, de-accelerate. That would be already something, and that should be part of college education.
So is the only way philosophy and the kind of deep contemplation that we deeply engage in and fully endorse, is the only way we're going to get into the public sphere is to change the culture? How do we cope in the cultural environment in which we actually find ourselves, in which people's attention spans get shorter and there's more and more information? What do we do given the realities around us?
Let me give you one example, okay? I mean, IHUM is the Introduction to the Humanities lecturing course at Stanford. And everybody complains about it because they have to do lots of humanities in the first year, in the freshman year. And so there's a lot of pressure that you digitalize everything, that you create websites, and that you don't speak for too long. Well, I'm insisting that I will do an IHUM on what is a classic today in the winter of next year. I will do 20 lectures of 50 minutes and will do my best for them to find that interesting, but to relearn to listen to a lecture. And I will not do everything on the website.
Well, good luck.
Yes, I know. But I'm close to retirement.
Yeah, you're a tenured full professor with an endowed chair. If you were trying to get tenure on that basis, dude, I don't know.
Well, but that's the whole point. As I am a tenured professor with an endowed chair, if I don't try to do that, it will get lost. I mean, President Hennessy told me already, well, that type of lecturing will no longer exist in the future. So at least, I do my last...
well, it's important that it exists in the present. Then.
Yes.
Let's take one last question. Welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Thank you. I'm Mary Jane. We're wondering, these questions, a lot of people get those answered in spiritual pursuits. And I think contemplation, a lot of people have these questions and they are finding the realms or the communities are more in the spiritual area. So I'm curious how philosophy connects with that, or what do you?
Well,
what are
okay,
your thoughts?
So I'm going to say something that may upset you. So I'm like John said. Oh, we have to come to grips with the result of contemporary science that says it's all just atoms in the void. We have to come to grips with that. At the same time, we are human beings with these deep yearnings for meaningfulness and connection and all that sort of stuff. And the challenge, and here's what I think one of the things philosophy is for, to take those deep yearnings and that reality and say, how can they live together? Now, religion gives you answers and stuff like that, but I don't think those answers can't be sustained. So we need a new set of answers that says, yes, here's how this deep yearning can be sustained in the face of these terrible facts, right? That it's just matter in the void. So I don't think there's an easy answer. I think it's a deep challenge, but I do think it's kind of it's been a challenge we faced since, I don't know, Descartes, the rise of the scientific revolution, and we haven't really quite figured it out.
So you're a kind of a cup is half full type philosopher, right? And we got to fill it up the rest of the way. We got to get ourselves back into so that the human condition is bearable the way it used to be when we believed in myths.
Well, that's good.
I'm all for that. You're that way, Dan Dennett is that way. Sometimes, maybe Monday, Tuesday, I'm that way. The rest of the time, the cup is half empty, and, maybe I'll be out of here before it's totally empty. But in the meantime, philosophy is just itself enjoyable.
Well, I mean, the two, we both with different objects say maybe what we are claiming here, we are the last generation. That may well be true. I mean, for the question, actually, I do think that there's a parallel or a functional equivalent to certain spiritual endeavors, spiritual exercises. But, I think to say that philosophy, in a way, both historically and systematically, is the secular form of that. And that's okay, because if it could only be done in a church or in a religious community, then what for those who want to contemplate and have a hard time, like myself, for example, believing in any transcendental being? Yeah, I mean, can you not be spiritual? Can you not discuss deep questions, as Ken would say, without being religious, which is my case, and I think I can, and I have a right to.
Well, that's what you have to establish through philosophical thinking. But you know what? On that note, I'm going to thank you for joining us. It's been a really great conversation, Seb.
Thank you.
Our guest has been Hans Gumbrecht. He's a professor of comparative literature at Stanford University. He's author of the forthcoming Reading Moods, about a different ontology of literature.
And we also want to thank everyone in our audience for participating in the program. Please give yourself a nice round of applause.
This conversation continues, as always, on our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog. You can also find out more by visiting our very active Facebook page.
You can sign up to get a weekly free podcast of our program at philosophytalk.org. For the final word, we speed through the public square with Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes. Sometime in 1961, lost now in the haze of memory, I came home from school to find the bookcase my father had been assembling in the garage, now standing in the living room, and filled with brand new books, close to 60 in all. Hobbes and Descartes, the complete works of Shakespeare, Homer and Plato and Dostoevsky, Archimedes and Plutarch, Spinoza, William Harvey, Newton, and John Locke, each volume with the name of the author or authors in gold lettering on the spine against a muted green, gray, red, or blue background, and over that, in gold vertical lettering, the announcement, Great Books. We were a family of readers, my mother histories and mysteries, my father more of a periodical kind of guy. We had subscriptions to Newsweek, Life, the New Republic Saturday Review, my sister too young yet to go beyond picture books. I read Mad Magazine comics, James Thurber, S.J. Perelman, and Richard Matheson. For a while, we were members of the Book of the Month Club. So there we were, our Midwestern Middleborough family with the great books of the Western world fully assembled in our home. The project had been the brainchild of University of Chicago President Robert Hutchins and the philosophy popularizer Mortimer Adler. A deal was struck with Encyclopedia Britannica to publish the set. Less than 2,000 volumes were sold in its first year, 1952. To improve sales, Britannica set experienced encyclopedia salesmen out on the road to sell the great books door to door. Over 50,000 sets were sold in 1961, still sold today. It has expanded over the years and is quite popular with homeschoolers. And we were among the first proud owners. But in that paradise of knowledge finally attained and available to anyone in a series of small monthly payments, there was a problem. Where to begin? Do you read them straight through, start with Homer, end with Freud? The thing was like a mountain. And I was 11. While Machiavelli might have taught me a few things about surviving junior high, he was a bit over my head. The translations, I realize now, were dated, public domain, stuffy, the typeface was small, and every book looked the same. Shouldn't Moby Dick have a picture of a whale on the cover crushing a ship? Shouldn't Shakespeare have pictures of Romans falling on swords? Shouldn't the Odyssey show a blinded Cyclops at the very least? And semi-vast as it was, were these 54 volumes it? These were all the great books in the world? If by chance we brought another different so-called great book, Gilgamesh, say, would that be an insult to the anthology? No writers of color, no non-European writers? The great books began to lurk in our living room like a huge, boring uncle who knew more than we did. Always let you know it, and wouldn't leave. For 50 years, my parents lugged the entire set from place to place, and none of us, to my knowledge, ever reading any of it. Finally, after moving into assisted living, my mother gave the set away to Goodwill. She kept back Moby Dick, though. One of these days, she might get around to reading it. I gotta go.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University. Copyright 2011.
Our executive producer is David Demarest. Special thanks to Eric Blazetsky, Stephanie Wiseman, Joshua Raul Brody, and Justine Kessler.
Thanks also to Dan Brandon, Caitlin Esch, Merle Kessler, Dave Millar, and Corey Goldman.
Our production coordinator is Devin Strolovich. Ben Hirsch is our Director of Research. Leo Weiss is our webmaster.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from the Templeton Foundation, various groups at Stanford University, the Friends of Philosophy Talk,
and from the members of KALW, local public radio, San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.
Thank you.